good afternoon. My name is Tom Hughes. I'm a Senior Market Services Executive at the IUA, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's session. So thank you very much for joining. This is, of course, the fourth and final event in the series of 4 aviation wordings masterclasses that are being hosted by the IUA Junior Aviation Practitioners Working Group. So before we get started, I have a couple of very quick pieces of housekeeping. We will be recording the session and will circulate a link to the recording along with the presentation slides after the event. Please do just bear with us as we have to gain the approval of the speakers and just check the content, so it will likely be early next week. You will also have probably already spotted that there's a Q&A facility within the platform, or you're already familiar with it. Please do make full use of that to pose any questions that you have for our speakers. We will also be making use of the poll functionality, so you'll see a few questions crop up at different points during the session. Please do respond to those. We'll be collating all the responses, anonymizing them, and having a look at those during the session. And lastly, hopefully you received the clause pack that the IUA events manager, Deborah Finch, sent ahead of the session. This has been updated following our last session with some additional 67B and C clauses. So as with all of the sessions today, I would stress that we are all here to learn, so there really are no incorrect questions, but I'll restate that our experts are of course here to provide their individual views on the rationale behind model aviation clauses and their theoretical operation only. So we won't be able to answer any questions that are related to ongoing coverage matters in the market, so please do refrain from asking those questions. Tony, if we move to the next slide, we can have a quick look at the formats for our masterclasses. I've mentioned that we've had 3 sessions now, our final wording session today, but after that, we will be moving into our 2 in-person claims masterclasses. We'll be able to apply some of the learnings from these wordings masterclasses in the context of an aviation large loss scenario and try to establish some of the key considerations for practitioners during the handling of a large loss. So I think now it's the perfect opportunity to introduce our speakers. So I'm very pleased to say that we are again joined by Jette Warnels. Jette is Technical and Wordings Manager for Aerospace at AXA XL. And we have Gareth Howell, who is Underwriting Technical Director at Global Aerospace. Now, before I pass over to Jette and Gareth for their presentations, we'll move to the next slide and have a look at a quick audience poll. So you're probably familiar with this if you've attended any of the previous sessions, and we'd just like to find out if you have managed to make it along to any of the 3 sessions so far. So the options on screen, you can advise that you've attended all of the previous sessions, you've managed to make 2 out of 3, or you've attended one of the session. If you haven't managed to attend one so far, you can let us know if you've managed to receive the recordings from those sessions. So we'll just hold on for a moment as everybody provides their responses. Okay, and I think we're probably about ready to have a look at the responses. Okay, so 35% of people have managed to attend all of the previous sessions, which is excellent. You can see that just under 30% have managed to get to 2, a quarter have made it to 1, and then 5% haven't been to a session yet, but they have got the recordings, and there are only 6% of people that haven't been to a session or haven't received the recordings. But rest assured, you will have the recordings from all of the sessions after today's session has concluded. So, Tony, if we move to the next slide, we have a couple of outstanding questions from our previous session. And I'll put the first question that we have to Jette. So the question we received is it correct to assume that internet-related activities of an aircraft operator, such as online flight booking systems, are non-aviation risks, which are not covered under AVN40A?
Well, you know my thoughts on assume, but we won't go into that here. But we would not normally expect internet-related activities of the aircraft operator to be the aviation risk. However, AVN40A in its standard form or unamended or amended could potentially bring in those liabilities into the aviation policy. Therefore, to avoid that, and to clarify the coverage, the AVN124 was recently introduced to ensure that that type of business interruption that could be caused by those internet-related activities wouldn't fall to the aviation policy, because, as we know, the intention of the aviation policy is to cover bodily injury, property damage arising from an occurrence caused by the operation of aircraft. So, so the answer to the question, I think, is no. The answer is yes. Those activities should be a non-aviation risk.
Got it. Thank you very much. Hopefully that covers off that question for the individual who posed it. And we can move on to the next one for Gareth, which is it correct to assume that coverage for cyber attacks on booking systems causing either flight delays, cancellations, and or theft of passenger credit card or bank account data is available for an aircraft operator in a separate standalone pure cyber policy?
Okay, so I think it's probably a two-part answer to that question, Tom. Yes, there is a separate cyber market, which can quite possibly provide specific cyber coverage to an airline or other aviation businesses, which is designed for that kind of scenario. However, there could also be the potential for some coverage under the aviation policy. If we look at AVN40A, which is providing personal injury cover, and also if you look at the breadth of the bodily injury definition in some policies where you may have mental anguish covered as a standalone element, so you don't necessarily have a physical bodily injury, but just mental anguish, that's where some cyber cover could come in. And that is part of the reason why we now have AVN124 and the LIBA data event clause to exclude those kind of unintended losses that may have crept into the aviation policies. So I think the core answer is yes, there is a specific market for this, and it's not necessarily the intention that the aviation policy should pick up those cyber exposures.
Okay, yeah, I think that's really clear, and it covers off the questions that were raised following the previous session. So another opportunity for me just to remind everyone to make full use of the Q&A facility. I'll be very pleased to put the questions posed to Yeda and Gareth, so long as they fall within the parameters we mentioned. So I can now hand over to Yeda for her presentation. Hopefully, Yeda, you won't be too displeased. I think I've stolen a minute or two of your speaking time, but Yeda's going to talk to us about contractual provisions.
Thank you. And can we go on? Yes, we are already going on to the next slide. Now, the aviation policy has a standard exclusion in it, which provides that that we're not covering contractual liability of the insured unless it would have attached in the absence of the contract having been entered into. However, there will be from time to time agreement by insurers to include some of those assumed liabilities to the extent that coverage is provided under the policy already. And in order to make it easy, I suppose, we've seen more automatic provisions in the slips in recent years. We're now looking at many automatic provisions, and they're expressed often in the way that we see it on the slide here. Typically, we have a section that talks about AV67, and that because that's a standard lease agreement, it may talk about 67B. In this case, we reference A, sometimes we reference C, and those are automatically agreed. They don't even have to be referred to the underwriters. Obviously, at a time of a loss on one of those aircraft that's subject to an AV67 clause, we will need to deal with it and the contractual provisions such as they apply. But that would generally be an automatic provision. The premium of $100, or as previously agreed, it says here, we state is receipt of which is acknowledged. This is to make sure that there is consideration for this additional coverage element. We discussed that previously when we talked about 67. To create a contract, there needs to be consideration. There's further language, new agreements other than in respect of new aircraft finance, the ones under 67B, where they're entered into by the insured, will often require approval by the insurers, except for those entered into in pursuance of the normal commercial operations in accordance with the usual practice of air transport industry. You'll see wordings or words like that on the slip, variations of it, but it's basically says that if it's the standard contract that everybody signs up to, then it is generally automatically included under the insurance contract. As I said before, we will not make the coverage broader than is provided under the policy, but we can include those elements that are already provided cover for the benefit of the interested parties. And the general language is in the third box at the bottom of this slide. Additional insured, hold harmless agreements, waivers of rights of subrogation, indemnity agreements, breach of warranty provisions, assignments, loss payable clauses, and the terms of contractual agreements enforced prior to the commencement of the policy are generally approved automatically, because one would assume that they have already been agreed by the insurers on a previous policy. And as we continue the coverage for the insured, it's fair that those previously agreed contracts remain covered under the policy insofar as they still apply. And then, can I have the next slide, please? Nope, we go back. Sorry, I thought there was another bit. So they're automatically incorporated herein, and I should have referred to the top right-hand corner. That's the one that talks about new agreements, and they will be automatically approved where they are in the normal commercial operation of the usual practice of the air transport industry. So all of those elements, if we need to add an additional insured, if we need to agree to hold harmless agreements, which of course can to a certain extent undermine the insurer's right if they have to pay a claim, if they waive rights of subrogation, if they include additional insureds, that adds potentially extra exposure under the policy, but subject to the insurer's prior agreement or discussion, we can include those provisions additionally to what's already in the policy. I don't know if there's much else to say about this other than if you're an underwriter, to know your client, you need to understand who they contract with, and if you're the broker, you would need to know again who the insured contracts with, and ensure that the policy you put in place has the appropriate provisions to ensure that we have smooth operation and the insured can go about his normal business. Anything that's outside of the usual provisions will need to be referred to underwriters and negotiated. Sometimes there'll be an additional premium, sometimes there'll be certain conditions, and where we include where we agree to waive rights of subrogation, etc., we may do so subject to excluding gross negligence and willful misconduct. So the normal negligence is covered. All accidents are caused by somebody's negligence somewhere along the line. It's sometimes been referred to as the holes in the cheeses line up. When everything is aligned, then that's when the accident happens. Often it's not one thing in isolation. It's a couple of things that will cause there to be an accident and an occurrence arises. So that's actually a little bit quicker than I had expected my words to be, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Swip on to the next slide.
Thank you very much, Yeda, and no apologies required. I think that was a comprehensive run through of the contractual provisions. I don't believe we have any specific questions that have cropped up in respect of that first section. There's still plenty of opportunity. If you have got questions on this section, we can always deal with them later on. Equally, if you have questions on any other topics, including if we've covered them in previous sessions, please feel free to raise them via the Q&A. So I think...
Tom, if I could just chime in on the contractual part.
Of course,
it's worth saying about the fact that nothing within the contractual provisions, notwithstanding they might be automatic for any contractual requirements, it doesn't expand the coverage provided by the policy. So you quite often will see in contracts, insurance requirements and what an insurance policy should be taken out by the insured, what they should cover, etc. But just because you have automatic contractual provisions for additional insureds, breach warranty, etc., doesn't mean that the coverage is broadened under the policy.
No, that was the bit I hope was picked up by my introduction, that we're not extending the coverage. We're taking on the liabilities that are assumed by the insured under a contract he signs up, to the extent that coverage is provided under the policy already. If there's anything else, then it needs to be negotiated, and underwriters would specifically have to agree, and they may do so at times, depending on what it is, and they may do so with an additional premium. So that's absolutely right. The policy does not get extended by whatever is in the contract. The contract is not incorporated into the policy, and does not change the conditions of the policy. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you both very much. Gareth, I think I can hand over to you now, and you can take us through products and airports policies.
Sure, thanks, Tom. So if we go to our first slide today, I'm going to try and cover products and airports policies in the next 40 minutes or so. We haven't got time to go through everything in full detail, but hopefully we'll get enough to get a good feeling for this. So the first thing is, there are lots of different options for how you can provide product liability cover or airport liability cover. And I've put some of the commonly used options on the screen here today, and really split them into three categories. So the first there, AVN98 or the successor to that, AVN28A, are really our major products wordings published by AICG, and would be suitable for a major products manufacturer in the aviation space. The next two we have down are the aerial fly wording and the AVN version of the fly wording, AVN126, and this is our PHP wording, premises hangar keepers and products liability insurance. And this is really designed as more of an intermediate wording, not for a major products manufacturer, but if, for example, you had a maintenance operation, that might be suitable for an AVN126 wording. And then the final couple I've put on there are the aerial major airport wording, and then the AVN version of that, AVN104, which is the dedicated airport liability insurance. It's fair to say that you may have one risk, that it's feasible to use various different options, and you might choose one of these wordings, which would be fine, and you might choose another of them, which would also work. So there are options available. Tony, if we go to the next slide. So the question really is, which policy form should you use? And it really is down to the broker to make this decision. They're the ones that need to make sure that the policy meets the requirements of the insured's business, making sure that they're covering the right exposures, making sure that the correct sections of cover are purchased, or extensions to the standard policies required, limits, of course, and just the rights and the duties of the insured, are they clear within the policy that's been chosen? Now, this is really down to the broker to make these determinations. Obviously, the underwriters can help with this process, but ultimately it's the broker as agent of the insured that makes those decisions. I should also say that there are also numerous other options other than the 6 that I put on the screen. So brokers have their own wordings, underwriters have their own wordings. There are ABC wordings, there are all sorts out there. So there is quite a myriad of choices as you go through this process. Tony, if we go to the next slide. Today, I'm going to focus on two of the wording. So I've picked AVN98A for our products wording, and we're going to look at AVN104 when we come on to talk about airport liability insurance. So next slide, turning to AVN98A then. This is a sectionalized policy. So there are different sections for the different heads of cover, and we'll go through each one and you'll see that there's a bit of a common theme running through them. So the first section of AVN98A, section 1A, is the products liability cover. So we don't need to go through it all, but the common theme is that we're covering bodily injury or property damage. There has to be an occurrence. And for this section 1A, we're talking about liability arising out of the products hazard. So what is the products hazard? Let's have a look at that on the next slide. So you remember we have to have an occurrence, and then we're talking about an occurrence that's arisen out of really using a product or a condition that exists in a product after that product has left the possession or control of the insured. So i.e. we're talking about finished products that have been delivered to the customer. And then when the customer uses that product, they find that there's a condition in that product which has caused an occurrence that has led to the BI or the PD. The second part of that products hazard definition really is just a clarification that a completed aircraft, notwithstanding it's being finished and delivered to the customer, if it comes back to our insured for perhaps for repairs, modifications, or our aircrew are flying that aircraft, then that's deemed not to be under our control. So it's still deemed to be a products hazard, even though it's actually back with us for a temporary period. Now, within that definition, we also had a defined term there, aviation product. So let's also look at what aviation product means. Tony, if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is quite a broad definition of what we mean by an aviation product. So obviously we're talking about aircraft that have been completed, but also, and this was updated in AVN 98A, we're also talking about UASs, so unmanned aerial systems, drones. We've also got space vehicles, satellites, and then any article forming part thereof of any of these things, an aircraft, UAS, space vehicle, or satellite. Also, anything for use in connection with aircraft or spare parts for aircraft. So it's quite a broad definition of what we mean by an aviation product. And then in II, we're not just talking about physical products here, we're also talking about associated things that go with the product. So whether we're talking about the instruction manual, the engineering data that was supplied with the product, if there are discrepancies, for example, in the manual, which means that the product doesn't work as intended, and that leads to a loss, then that is also within the scope of what we mean by an aviation product. Let's look at the next slide. Now, this is the exclusions applying to the products liability section, but please, I'm not talking about every exclusion within the products liability section, otherwise we would be here until the evening. You'll remember when we looked in sessions 1 and 2, if you were here, that we did talk about some more standard exclusions, you know, like liability for bodily injury to employees, this kind of thing. There's lots of standard exclusions that are also excluded within AVN 98A, but I'm only going to look at some of the ones that are specific to the products cover, really. So the first one there, which is exclusion C within section 1A, the cost of repairing or replacing any defective aviation product. And really what we're talking about here is product recall. The coverage isn't there to provide recall cover. So if you've got defective aviation products out in the field and you have to bring them back, fix them, send them back out to the customer working again, that's not covered by this aviation policy. The second exclusion there that I've got, exclusion D, improper or inadequate performance, design or specification. What we're talking about there really is warranty cover. So if the product just fails to perform as it was expected to or designed to, then that also is not covered by this policy. The caveat being that if that failure to perform leads to an occurrence, which leads to bodily injury or property damage, then that part is covered, but just a failure to perform as designed is not covered by this policy. And then the third exclusion that I've looked at under the products liability section is exclusion G, so loss of use of an aircraft. That is not covered by this section of the policy. However, we will look at a limited element of loss of use cover in a moment. Tony, if we go to the next slide. So the next part of section 1B, grounding liability. And this is where we're talking about a limited cover for loss of use of an aircraft. So if we have a completed aircraft that is grounded, then there is an element of cover for that under this section B of the policy. So what actually is a grounding? So what we're talking about is a mandate issued by a regulator. So it's normally an airworthiness directive, but it could also be some other kind of mandatory order that says you must not fly this aircraft because there's a safety issue with the aircraft that needs to be resolved. So there has to be a withdrawal from all flight operations mandated by that airworthiness directive because there's an issue with the safety of operating the aircraft. And there has to have been an occurrence that's led to this situation. So classic scenario is aircraft crash, leads the regulator to believe that that crash was caused by a product failure. They decide that it's not safe to fly any other aircraft of that type until they've worked out what the problem is. They issue an airworthiness directive saying, do not fly this aircraft until you've made modifications. That is within the definition of what a grounding is under section 1B of AVN41A. So moving on, section 2 of the policy are really some what I would call non-core sections of AVN41A. So products and grounding is really the core coverage that's being purchased. We then have some other coverages for aircraft liability. So ownership, operation or use of the aircraft. This is as in an owned aircraft by the insured. And then we have non-owned aircraft liability. So an aircraft that's been chartered or hired by our insured, liability arising out of the operation of that non-owned aircraft can be covered by section 2B. These sections, quite often you're going to find that section 2 isn't purchased, but the option is there that these coverages can be included. For example, if you've got a major insured, there may be some non-owned exposure, there may be some owned aircraft liability exposure. Must remember, however, when we've got aircraft liability on here, that there is no hull coverage under AVN41A. So it is important to note that it's not comprehensive cover for an aircraft if you choose to use section 2A of AVN41A. Next slide, please, Tony. Okay, the next section of AVN41A, an important one, section 3A, the premises liability. And this is quite broad coverage as well, but again, with that common theme. So bodily injury or property damage, there has to be an occurrence. And this is for liability arising in or about any premises used by the insured in connection with the aviation business. And it's important to note that it's any premises used by the insured. It doesn't have to be their premises, doesn't have to be the head office or the maintenance facility of the insured, but it's any premises that they're using in connection with the aviation business. And if there's an occurrence at those premises that causes BI or PD, that's covered by the premises section. So it could be someone slipping over in the lobby of the maintenance shop and you have a small bodily injury claim, that could be covered by this section. Or it could be something much bigger in relation to an accident at the premises. Let's look at some exclusions now on the premises section. Again, I'm not looking at them all. This is a selective look at the exclusion. So the first one that I picked out, exclusion C, and we've looked at this before actually. This is the vehicle exclusion. So if you were in those earlier sessions, you'll recall we're not covering liability arising out of the use of vehicles where there's compulsory insurance requirements. So if Road Traffic Act applies, or if a vehicle is being used on the public highway, they are not covered by the aviation policy. However, within the confines of an airport or an airfield, if there is no RTA law, meaning you don't have to buy motor insurance by law, or on an excess basis, excess of any statutory limit required, or excess of the limit of the auto policy that the insured buys, then there is limited cover under the aviation policy for that liability arising out of the use of vehicles within the confines of an airport or an airfield. And this language is very standard, by the way. We've taken it from AVN41A, but you will see this in a number of policies, be they AVN policies or not. Let's have a look at the next exclusion. So within the premises section, coverage doesn't apply to exclusion D, air meets, air races, air shows, not covered as standard under 98A. Next one, exclusion E, construction liability. So construction, demolition, alterations to buildings, runways, installations. If you've got work going on at the maintenance facility, that's not covered by the aviation policy as a result of this exclusion. It may be that there is a specific policy purchased for construction activities, or it may be that there's a limited right back given to this exclusion to cover certain activities, certain contracts, certain projects. And we do also have that standard right back in there that we're not talking about routine maintenance operations that may be ongoing at the building or at the site. And then the other exclusion on this page that I wanted to touch on quickly, G, liability arising out of ATC activities, whether it's full ATC or an airfield control tower, that's excluded as standard by this exclusion under the premises section. Let's move on. So we're going to look, the next section of the policy we're going to look at is hangar keepers liability. And certainly early in my career, I had some confusion as to exactly what we were talking about when we were thinking about hangar keepers liability. So let's have a quick look at this poll and see what people think. So which of the following scenarios would be covered by the hangar keeper section of a policy? So an engineer spills oil on the carpet of a customer's aircraft whilst it's in the maintenance hangar. An aircraft engine belonging to a customer is dropped from an engine hoist. And a customer's aircraft is hit by a forklift truck whilst it's parked outside for an engine test following maintenance. So spilling oil on the carpet in the maintenance hangar, dropping an engine from an engine hoist, and hitting an aircraft with a forklift truck whilst it's parked outside for an engine test. Which of these do we think is covered by a hangar keeper section of the policy? Tony, do we have the options as to which ones they can choose? Okay, let's have a quick look at what people have chosen. Right, so we've got 23% have gone for the oil spill on the carpet, 43% for the engine being dropped, and a third saying the aircraft being hit by a forklift truck whilst it was outside. Yeah, the correct answer is all of them. And we didn't give you that option, but all of these scenarios are covered by a hangar keeper section. And quite often in the past, I've been, people have made comments about, well, why is it called hangar keepers if you're covering aircraft whilst they're outside the hangar? That's just part of what we cover. And also, it doesn't have to be an aircraft when we're talking about hangar keepers cover. It can be aircraft components, engines, like we talked about an engine being dropped there. So let's go on and look at the coverage that's provided by 98A for hangar keepers. So here we're only talking about property damage. This is not a bodily injury cover. We're only talking about PD here. And property damage caused by an occurrence. And then here we've got aircraft or aircraft equipment. And it has to be whilst that aircraft or aircraft equipment is in the insured's care, custody or control for servicing, handling, maintenance or storage. So it's a third-party aircraft that the insured's responsible for that becomes damaged whilst it's in their care, custody or control. So the classic example is an aircraft that's in for maintenance in a maintenance facility. The aircraft gets damaged while it's being maintained. That is a hangar keeper's claim. And the one exclusion that we have as standard to look out for is that if we don't cover PD to aircraft whilst the aircraft is in flight. So if there's a post-maintenance test flight being conducted by the insured, then that is not covered as standard for damage to the aircraft that results whilst the aircraft's being flown. It's an exclusion that can be brought back, but it's just important to note and to understand whether the insured has exposure for in-flight hangar keepers when the policy is being put together. Let's go to the next slide.
Gareth, before we take a look at airport liability insurance, I wondered if we could just probably give you a break for a moment and ask a couple of the questions that have cropped up in the Q&A. Yeah. And also, I'm very impressed that we managed to ask a poll question where absolutely everyone was right, which I thought was fantastic. So the first question that came in, a simple one, but I think a very good one, is what is the difference between AVN98 and AVN98A? And I know there are a few distinctions here, so maybe we can give Yeda the opportunity to come in once you provided an answer.
Yeah, I mean, we can't go through all the differences between the two wordings, but it was a modernization effort of 98 when we developed AVN98A, and a simplification. So we dropped some sections of cover that were present in AVN98 when we had the AVN98A wording. So it's hopefully a simpler form to use, but does provide comprehensive cover. And for example, I think we had working parties extension under 98, which is now incorporated as standard in the premises section. I think we had an airport liability section even in 98, which is not in AVN 98A. So it really was a modernization and simplification effort.
Yes, I don't have much more to add than Gareth already mentioned there, but the major thing was the change to the working parties and tidying or modernizing the wording. But it's the AV98 is still used in the marketplace, so we see a mix of the forms. I think it's to do with familiarization. The brokers and the clients haven't yet become familiar with the new form, although the new form is probably is probably a clearer form and a better form.
Excellent. No, that's very useful, and actually it is worth pointing out as well on the AICG website, when an updated 98A was published, I think there was quite a comprehensive guidance note that was developed at the time discussing some of the changes, so that could be worth a look. As Gareth mentioned, we would be here a while, I imagine, if we started talking about the various amendments. So we have a few more questions that have come through. A couple of them are on hangar keepers, but maybe we'll deal with something on the premises section first. So does the premises section also pick up working parties liabilities if the insured is covered at any premises used by the insured?
So yes is the short answer to that. Yeah, so we don't make any reference to working parties under AVN 98A, but that exposure is covered as standard by the premises section of AVN 98A. So working parties, for those that aren't aware, this is when you've got employees of the insured doing activities at a third-party site. So it might be a maintenance engineer that goes on site at the airline, and while they're there, they cause damage to some airline property. That is a working party's exposure, but it's captured under the premises section of the AVN 98A wording.
But can I just add to that, in that the working parties section does cover when they're the product they're working on, if it's insured product, when they're working away from the premises. So there is an element of damage under what is essentially a premises section coverage for something that's in their care costing control. And that's the working parties, isn't it? When they're working on the product that's been supplied.
Got it. Okay. We've had a question in from Michael. His first question on hangar keepers. Yeda, I'll put this to you in the first instance. So whilst under hangar keepers section of 98A, there is an exclusion for in-flight hangar keepers liability, could there be an argument that this type of cover is included under the products section to be non-owned aircraft use?
Well, remember that the non-owned aircraft use covers third-party liability and excludes damage to the aircraft itself. The hangar keepers section covers damage to the aircraft. So in the standard hangar keepers section, as Gareth said earlier, we're not covering hulls, we're covering liability. So there's no first party, and likewise there's no, we wouldn't be covering the insured liability from operating aircraft under the hangar keeper section. So if we include in-flight hangar keepers, then we have to find the aircraft liability section somewhere else. And that could be included under the non-owned or under the aircraft liability section, depending on how the policy is constructed. But unless you buy all the right sections, if you simply write back the exclusion, delete the exclusion, for example, then you're lacking coverage. You do not have cover for damage that aircraft might cause on the ground. So you have to be careful with how you construct the policy. Hangar keepers is covering damage to the aircraft itself, but as a liability.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Edo, and I can see Gareth nodding. So I'll move on to the next question, which is, if you extend coverage to allow for spares and then have technical records cover, would you expect this to be automatically covered under the hangar keepers cover, as in full limits, or should the clause that allows for this cover be over both spares and hangar keepers coverage? What are your thoughts?
You start, Gareth, I'll add something.
I have to add a lot. I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think it's well, I'll start with how I understand the question.
It is a complex one. Go for it, Yeda.
Remember that the hangar keeper section is a liability policy. We're covering damage to the aircraft. The technical records are a separate item. This is an asset that belongs to the owner of the aircraft, and spares would be a first party coverage as well. So both technical records and spares would be first party coverage. So no, we would not expect the hangar keepers to pick up that coverage. We would expect to add a spare section for an appropriate limit, and we would expect to add technical records clearly defined as to what it is we're intending to cover under that particular policy and whose responsibility is to look after those technical records. And we would provide the cover again under a separate section, and most likely with a sub-limit and an aggregate limit. That's the way that coverage is normally provided in the market. But of course, every policy is a bespoke policy. But it would be incredibly unusual, unless it was a very small CSL, to include technical records for a full policy limit. The technical record coverage is there to reconstruct the records that have been lost, which means that a major check may need to be performed on the aircraft to verify that it is in that condition and that the records can be reinstated.
Yeah,
Do you want to add something, Gareth?
Sounds good to me, Yeda. But yeah, Gareth, anything to add?
No, couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Yeda.
There we go.
Thanks.
Our correspondent on all things hangar keepers and tech records, clearly. Okay, well, I think that we've got through the questions. Thank you very much to those of you who put those in. Clearly, your comments around hangar keepers sparked some interest there, Gareth. So we'll allow you to carry on with 104.